Okay, hello everyone. I want to welcome you all to our panel today. I think it's a very timely moment to be holding a panel on this topic, on the climate crisis and the intersection of human rights, and what different types of journalism can offer us when we are covering this issue. My name is Kim. I am one of the trainers in the Solutions Journalism program. I am currently based out of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And we have three wonderful panelists with us here today who I am very excited to hear from. So I believe we can start turning the cameras on for our participants now so that they can take a moment to introduce themselves. So if we could start with Jessie.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessie Firempong, and I am of Ghanaian and British settler heritage. And I'm usually based on Parliamentary territory in BC, just north of Powell River. Today, I'm calling in from London, Ontario. So the traditional territory, most recently of the Chippewas of the Thames, Oneida of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. And I have just started as a columnist at the National Observer in the last couple of months. And before that was working on climate communications at Greenpeace Canada, as well as with a bit of a background in human rights and gender justice here in Canada and in Ghana and Botswana. So I'm really excited to be here today with Jerome and Stephanie, a little intimidated, but yeah, really excited to have this conversation and to be here with you guys. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jessie, and thank you for joining us today. If we could head over to Jerome now.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jerome Turner. I'm Gitsan and Swedish. I'm coming to you today from Secwepemc Uluk on the unceded territory of the Secwepemc in Kamloops. Yeah, I'm just very excited to be here today and yeah, offer what I can.
Thank you, Jerome, and we'll hand it over to Stephanie now.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm from Squamish Nation. I'm speaking to you from our territory, also known as North Vancouver. And yeah, I'm a journalist with the Narwhal and report on stories about the natural world here in BC. So also super happy to be here, with Jessie and Jerome, and Jessie should not be intimidated.
Great, and just a little note about the planning of the webinar. We will go through some prepared questions first, and then at the end, we will open it up to any questions the audience might have, but you can feel free to send in your questions at any time when they come to you. So we will get started with our first question, and that is, how is climate change impacting communities and individuals' human rights? And how are marginalized communities disproportionately affected? Again, if we could start with Jessie for this question.
Sure, yeah. So I think one of the things we talk about a lot when we talk about climate change and human rights is the fact that climate change is a threat multiplier. And as Marianne Hegler wrote last year, that we really saw that come into really strong play last year with COVID, where we had this year of kind of converging crises. We had wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, we had COVID, we had this sort of, burgeoning of the movement for Black lives. And so I think that that's something that's really important to talk about. So when we see climate impacts, whether we're talking heat waves or wildfires or floods or rising sea levels, when we see that intersect with longstanding inequalities in our society, the people who have been pushed to the margins are always hit hardest. And they also have the fewest resources available to deal with those. So they are not as resilient and have less to kind of bounce back with. And I think we saw a bit of that even in Lytton in the last couple of weeks, where rural and remote communities, as a recent Natural Resources Canada report pointed out, are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And we saw that First Nations leaders talking about how, the failures of the province to really engage before crises hit on a nation-to-nation level and to work out those plans with them created a vulnerability which left the nations to coordinate evacuations from the fire themselves. And I think globally we see that as well. where communities who are working to make their living off the land are facing, different seasonal rains, different growing seasons that make them more vulnerable when they may already be dealing with things, including extreme poverty and hunger and droughts and floods already. But I think what we don't talk about enough when we talk about climate change is how human rights are part of why the climate crisis is happening. We often talk about climate change as this sort of unnatural scientific phenomenon. Like on a graph, we see our emissions rising over time, and we're like, what technology can we input to bring those emissions down quickly? But I think that, we have to back up and understand climate change as a colonial problem, as a cultural problem, and as a political problem. There's sort of always been this assumption going back to, colonial explorations here in Canada and in the global South, that some people's rights can be sacrificed, and that some people's land can be taken to extract value from. And the idea that we can extract that value to make profit is sort of like an assumption of how we've built our societies today. And that's a bit cultural, this idea that we should all work to be able to consume, to be able to live, to be able to then make profit for corporations is sort of how we've organized. And the people that profit from that are the people who are in our governments, are the people who have the ears of our politicians. Last year with Greenpeace, we tracked the Canadian oil industry's meetings with elected officials. And we found that in 2020 alone, during COVID, there were over 1,000 meetings between our elected, not necessarily elected officials, but federal officials and the oil industry. So that's like a rate of about 3 meetings per day that the fossil fuel industry is meeting with our elected officials. And there's a huge amount of power there. We saw that Natural Resources Canada has actually identified itself as a champion for the fossil fuel sector. So I think if we're looking at this as a technological problem and not as a political problem, where some people are allowed to pollute people's lands and ignore their human rights, then we're not actually going to solve the problem. It's kind of like someone with multiple comorbidities and complicated illnesses. You can't just throw antibiotics at them. You have to address the root cause of the infection. So human rights isn't something we have to address while we address climate change. It actually is part of addressing climate change. And so I think we need to talk about that a bit more and less in terms of like a charitable mitigating way when we talk about human rights and climate change.
Thank you. And Jerome, did you have something to add on there?
Yeah, that's Jesse covered a lot there. I think equity of outcome is not really like a line item on most corporate models. So that's where I think the root of what needs to change happens, where climate impacts are visited on smaller communities. The root cause is the fact that corporations have to increase their profitability, and that generally plays out in suffering of people who don't have those decision-making powers. So I think, yeah, sorry. Yeah, Jesse covered a lot of stuff that I was going to say. Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, the village of Lytton is definitely like what one of the residents said, is the canary in the mine shaft, right? Like, we have to be able to see these places in the surrounding areas. Like, Indigenous people can't move from these places. They are rooted in these territories and lands, and making sure that they have a future it shouldn't be left to them to make that change. So individuals, I think, should be putting pressure on government, corporations to make that change.
Absolutely. And Stephanie?
Yeah, no, I agree. Both Jesse and Jerome just really spoke to that really well, giving all that context. So I thought I would just give a bit of maybe personal, like the kind of things I hear from people to answer that part of the question, like, how is this impacting people right now? Because people are living it, right? And Lytton was the most recent intense and tragic example that we've all seen. It's an upsetting example, right? That even the evacuation, even the communication with the province was coming up short, and people were having to, as always, or as often, end up fending for themselves when an emergency struck. And so every day when I'm reporting, and also in my personal life too, with people that I speak to, the stuff that I'm hearing is, like, climate change is already impacting people materially day to day. They're wondering, is my water contaminated? What impacts is it having on my community? Is this a risk to my elders and to the kids in my community? Are enough fish going to come up this summer so that we can fill up our fridges? Do we have the funds that would be necessary if another flood hits our community? Where can we get funds to stop another flood from hitting our community by, taking on restoration work, which is expensive and requires hiring outside experts? And is a wildfire going to come through our community? And what can we do to stop it? Is there anything we can do to stop it so our home isn't destroyed? Our elders lack air conditioning. Does everyone have someone to come and check on them? What can we do to try to stop this project coming through our territory that we have said that we do not consent to? They've not gotten our through prior and informed consent, and this project is still being pushed through. How much money is it going to cost to fight this in court? Where do we get that money from in order to protect our families and our territory and our land? Like, these are stresses people are feeling every single day, and stuff like the heat wave or the fire may grab the attention of broader society, of people where it's not impacting them as materially, but there are people who are feeling it deeply and closely and being impacted materially every day right now.
Great, thank you. And we'll move on to our second question. We've talked a little bit about human rights, but this question is within the Indigenous worldview. What do these rights look like? Jerome, if you wanted to get us started on this question.
Yeah, as I said, I'm Gitsan. I was raised by my grandparents. They're both hereditary chiefs. They helped to instill in me the basics of what Indigenous worldview is. I have a pretty huge family. My father has 4 brothers, 7 sisters. They helped raise me. Like, it's a community that is responsible for raising each of us. The obligations, rights and responsibilities, they're all the same thing in our worldview. And obligations, responsibilities, and rights are what the capitalist system understands as ownership. Our cultures, our names that my grandparents hold, and the other chiefs that hold them as well, they're essentially corporations. They're passed on, and they come with a lot of responsibility. The land is essentially family. Like, it holds the same precursor as a lot of our clans. Or Lachkabu is wolf, Lachsale is frog. The land in Gitsan language is Lachye. That just tells the direct relationship that we have with it. And we learned from the animal population how to live in harmony with the nature. I'm sorry, and I think a lot of that was lost as colonization came through, and we're seeing the results of that imbalance. And I think people in Canada, the world, would do well to start paying attention to the Indigenous people, the leaders, the youth that are living up to those responsibilities, and trying to base the decisions on that Indigenous worldview, just to try and get back to that balance. I think it would do a lot to prevent further extreme weather. I think we're in a space where there's still time, and yeah, it would be great to listen to those Indigenous people.
Land is family. I think that's a beautiful sentiment, and I think we could all really improve the relationship we have with the land, and that could really change the way that the world is. And Stephanie, if you wanted to add on to that.
Yeah, no, everything, you just put everything so beautifully. I agree. And especially, I think it's so important what you said too, obligations, rights, and responsibilities are the same thing, but there's also the responsibility to take care of the land, to take care of our family, of our relatives, and that there's this collective aspect to rights as well, whereas often human rights may be kind of rooted in an individual mindset, at least when some people kind of talk about it in that context. Looking from Indigenous worldviews, it's often from a collective mindset, looking at community and looking at non-human relatives and looking at future generations, not just yourself in that moment. And for a story I spoke about, for a story I'm working on, I spoke to Kim Tolliver recently, which many of you have probably heard of, as she's a prominent academic. And she said, yeah, she doesn't even think about rights in that sort of United Nations human rights framework, because that's so human centric, and that's not how she sees the world. As much as it's, humans are still, humans should still have a home and water and food and safety. Our non-human relatives, our land as family should also have all of those things: safety, home, food, and water. And that it is a responsibility to ensure that everyone has access to those things. And so often, First Nations in particular, and racialized communities are forced to almost have to pick which they get to pursue. Like a story I wrote about recently was the Beaver Lake First Nation in Alberta, and they've been fighting this long case in court about how the oil sands, the cumulative impacts have led to ultimately being a treaty infringement, so that they can't practice hunting and fishing on their territory as they were promised they'd be able to do. And so that on its own, is this Indigenous rights case. And then on top of that, the case has gone on for years to the point that the First Nation can't afford battling in court anymore, and got some court costs awarded to them. And then the government is now trying to challenge that in court, that they shouldn't have any assistance, any advanced court costs in order to see this treaty case through. So now they're having to fight that in court and spend money on that. And the government's argument was largely based in, well, they have money for a water truck, so they have water to fight, they have money to fight this case, or they have money to fight this case. And the people at Beaver Lake are feeling like they're basically being told that they have to choose between addressing poverty and clean water or pursuing their treaty rights, which is just which is just manifestly unjust to those people. And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring a bit of that perspective in, but that's kind of a specific example of people almost being forced to choose between treaty rights and inherent human rights that we believe everyone's entitled to, and our non-human relatives.
Thank you. And with the understanding that we do still have time to act, we do still have time to make a difference, this question is for Jessie. What role does racial justice play in the climate recovery?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie and Jerome, for putting that so beautifully and so holistically. I think we've talked about why racial justice needs to be part of the climate, part of how we understand climate change. And I think it's important to recognize that, racialized communities have been doing environmental and climate justice work for a very long time. I think there's this perception that, kind of white Anglos and early colonial conservationists sort of started the modern environmental movement. Which isn't true. So I think one of the things we need to do is sort of address the erasure of racialized change makers. And I think that media has a really important role to play in that. We saw even just, I guess it was maybe a year ago where Ugandan climate activist Vanessa Nakate was cropped out of a photo of youth climate leaders. And so we kind of have the silencing of racialized voices. And I think it's important to address, because when you show the visibility and when you have people who are telling stories about the environment in a different way, you're increasing the public's understanding of the issue. And you're also getting representation that will also inspire other racialized folks to get involved and see a place for themselves in the climate movement as well. I think that a lot of the time there's a, an inherent white gaze in how we talk about the climate crisis and how we talk about the leaders in it. If you talked about artists or celebrities, people would probably say like Jane Fonda, David Attenborough, Mark Ruffalo, Leo DiCaprio. But why aren't we talking about Don Cheadle, who's a UN Environment Program ambassador, or Lupita Nyong'o's conservation work, Megan Three Stallions doing stuff. And there's this sort of idea that, white voices are for everybody and racialized voices are for racialized people and outlets servicing those people. And so I think that that's something that needs to change and can be a really important cultural element. A.J. Marie Brown says we're in an imagination battle when it comes to a lot of these rights issues. So I think that that can be huge. And the other thing I think when we're talking about solutions is, are we thinking about those also holistically in terms of who is at the table and who is profiting or being benefited? Something Christopher Wilson from the Ontario branch of the Canadian Union of Black Trade Unionists told me in a story I wrote 2 years ago for Asparagus magazine, talked about how a lot of the solutions and trades that people are advocating for under a Green New Deal, whether we're talking about construction for home retrofits to be more sustainable, or other trades, actually Black people are very underrepresented in those trades, and often they're paid 70 cents on the dollar compared to their white counterparts. So I think that when we're advocating for solutions, we need to think about them from an equity lens. And I think that's true here in Canada. With that example, in the South, if we're making more lithium batteries that are rechargeable for EVs, if we're making more power devices for solar and wind, we're going to need cobalt, lithium, copper, and a lot of those resources come from Latin America. Most of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC, where people are dealing with not only the pollution from those mines, but also child labor, artisanal mining. So I think that as we're thinking of these solutions, we need to be thinking about how to do them with the consent of the communities in Canada and abroad, and in a way that's sustainable. So I would love to see more accountability journalism there, where people are holding Canadian companies abroad accountable, where we're not just picking up the wire stories from abroad, but we're actually unpacking them for a Canadian context. And that's something I see French media do a bit more because of the language issue. And because they have these reporters, just unpacking these for a Quebec audience. So that's something that I think the media could do a huge, huge service for getting to just solutions.
Thank you. And I'll just remind everyone that if you do have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A box down there at the bottom, and we will have time to get to them at the end. And I will just move on to our next question here. We'll move a bit more into speaking about journalism and how journalism can keep the public informed and engaged about what's going on in the climate crisis. So for Jerome, what can the media do to ensure that the voices of those most affected by climate change are heard?
I think starting with the basic understanding that the narrative of what Indigenous people are, and like it's mainly Indigenous people in a lot of the rural communities. So the fact that Canada tries to blanket Indigenous peoples with the Indian Act, but also at the same time fractures them into different peoples, which we are. Like, we're different nations all across from Elsipogtog to like Haida Gwaii. Understand that all the Indigenous worldview is fairly similar all the way across there. There's different capacities and different stories and different reasons why colonization has impacted us more or less in all of those areas. So understanding that the stories of neglect are very important, but also the stories of innovation, and covering the stories of innovation and progress in these nations, like the Lubicon, where like people like Melina, Labaca, and Massimo are forwarding like solar solutions, wind solutions, is really important. And I don't think a lot of people across Canada really get to see those stories put on in a massive spotlight like they should be. But the same time, making sure the reason why those solar projects are necessary, like the massive oil spill of 25,000 barrels, what was it, 4.5 million liters, that happened to Little Buffalo, was the main driver of that. And I think the oil company that was responsible for the spill wasn't really doing anything while the community was severely impacted. Breathing, eyes were burning, lungs were burning, and they were doing nothing. And it was only because the community of Little Buffalo decided that they were going to investigate and put the word out. And Melina was really instrumental in making sure that that their plight was known. And so, yeah, just making sure that the full story is understood. So when journalists, when outlets are sent out, they should have a base understanding of where they're going, who the people are that live there. Like, there's always going to be Indigenous, non-Indigenous people there. There's going to be different interests. There's always going to be people who are for industry because they're generally forced into choosing to have money or live in squalor if they're not going to work in the industry that is the main economic driver of the area. So making sure that all of those are in the initial stories that come out. I think making sure that it is the voices of the people that are most affected that take the spotlight, as opposed to having government or industry voices be at the top of the story. That's like the lead. So yeah, that's, to me, that's what really needs to change.
I think media providing that underlying historical context can really help people understand why things are the way they are now, and also help them to challenge that and realize that things don't have to continue along this way. And for our next question here for Jesse, what role can climate accountability journalism play in addressing climate change and the climate recovery?
Yeah, I think that there's such a role for, like, the traditional accountability function journalism has played to really turn its attention to why we're in a climate crisis. So, you know, from the governments, the companies, the advertisers who have been involved in really, like, the delay and obstruction of climate policy, and holding the rich and powerful accountable for that. I think that we've seen a lot of that journalism like that coming from outlets like Ricochet and the Narwhal and the National Observer. And we've also seen in the South outlets like Heated, or by Emily Atkin, Drill by Amy Westerfeld, anything Marianne Hegler, you can probably tell I'm a fangirl, has written, really acknowledging this and trying to bring it into the public eye, because so often we talk about climate change as this thing that is happening instead of this thing that certain companies are doing. And so I think that there's a real power in recognizing that, because it's impossible to sort of thinking, how do I come up against, you know, this, I don't know, this act of God that, you know, you see on the fine print of insurance companies that are happening, versus here's something we can actually change by holding a select few accountable. And I think, you know, we've seen this start to change with, like, CBC's The National and Radio Canada's Enquête doing pieces on how Canadian and American oil companies have actually known about climate change since the 70s, and that their products were contributing to it, and how they actually went on campaigns of delay and climate denial. And I think that having those on national broadcasters in both languages is huge, especially for a resource-based economy like Canada, where the issue is so politicized. And so, yeah, I would love to see more journalism like that in Canada, more space for folks to dig that up. And, you know, I think it's also an interesting question for media, because these companies relied on media to spread the disinformation, to make climate science seem uncertain through columns, through advertorials. So what does that mean for how media are thinking about their advertising policies? What does that mean in terms of how they're seeing their role, or we are seeing their role, so I'm new to being considered we in media. So how do we see it as our role to sort of like unpack that and to address that history, I think is a really interesting question in terms of the stories we tell and how we engage with the villains of this story. And so, yeah.
I think always questioning how we're telling these stories is really important, and seeing how we can do it differently and do it better. And for Stephanie, you work at the Narwhal, and the Narwhal does a lot of solutions-focused pieces. So I was wondering, what role can solutions journalism play in addressing the climate crisis and ensuring that the voices of those most affected by climate change are heard?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I feel like especially in the last year and a bit since COVID hit, a lot of people were actually really, really hungry for those kind of solutions stories. And one thing I love that I actually learned in a JRCHR workshop was talking about solutions reporting and saying to report on them with just as much rigor as reporting on problems. And I just loved how that was put, doing in-depth work, investigating and asking hard questions and adding nuance to solutions journalism, because people want to learn from what other people are doing in the attempt to find solutions, and not pretending that anyone's solution is going to work for everybody for any of these complex challenges we're facing with climate change. But kind of similar to what Jerome was talking about too, is that a big part of it is going, to these straight to these smaller communities that are taking on these projects and are being real leaders. And because a lot of climate reporting that's kind of ineffective is when it's very vague, which kind of Jesse was speaking to as well, right? If you go to these smaller communities and find these people who are largely devoting big parts of their lives to these solutions, that really adds so much heart and detail, and also once again stuff that people can really learn from, is when you actually have a person at the center who's like, here's what's working for us, here's the challenges we're facing, here's how, and also, yeah, here's how much it costs, and here's what our community thinks about it, and here's who disagrees with us, and just really adding that nuance. And sometimes it can take definitely a longer time than we're used to in journalism to find the right person, because often the person who is most available or wants to speak to you the fastest and can get on the phone that afternoon and wants to often that person is someone a lot more comfortable with media, often in a power position, often has a narrative to share, and it's a lot harder to find those other people. I just did a story recently, and with a person who is not media savvy, is not in a power position, and they were worried about contributing, because so often when we're talking about climate change stories, these are people who are living right next door to industry, right? That they're trying to hold accountable for climate change, and that impacts their lives. So it can take a lot of time, a lot of back and forth in communication in order to be able to include those people and make them feel empowered, not endangered by being included. But yeah, just a couple examples of solution journalism we've been doing is looking at this series called Carbon Cache, which is communities that are doing projects to naturally sequester carbon in the environment through preserving forests or through preserving and rehabilitating grasslands that store immense amounts of carbon, and incorporating Indigenous knowledge into those projects. And another thing with that story in particular is that grazing cattle and farmers are a part of that story. They're a part of the solution. And that was also kind of breaking down, some stereotypes of how people may think who's on the side of climate change and who isn't. It really broke that down. And I just kind of wanted to finish with one last thing that I also just heard from another source for a story that's upcoming. And his name's Joseph Palant, and he's from EcoTrust. And he was just saying, he's talking about logging in particular, because we're talking so much about that, right? Old growth logging and the connection with climate change. And he was talking about, if you go to someone, if you go to a resource reliant community and just say, okay, well, it's time to stop logging now, then you're actually not really going to start a productive conversation, and it will continue to be this divisive thing. But if you go to people and ask open questions, like how would you like to harvest differently? What would you like to do differently? Then you can find that common ground. And so a lot of the projects that we look at, whether it's habitat restoration or creating wildlife, highways or anything like that, the successful ones always include the people whose land the project is on, the Indigenous peoples and the communities and those are the projects we see that are really having an impact on their area.
I think climate reporting is a really great area for solutions journalism, because I think so many people, they do want to be a part of the solution. They do want to see things that are working, because this is an area where it's really easy to get overwhelmed. It's really easy to feel like you just can't do anything in the face of these big industries who have millions and millions of dollars behind them. But we can see that in these communities, there are solutions that are working. They are working for the communities. And if we can share that and other people can learn from it, I think that that's a really great thing that journalism can do. That was the end of our prepared list of questions. So if anyone does have a question for our panelists, you can feel free to put it in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And we do have a question here from Brian Sakwa from Nairobi, Kenya. So thank you very much, Brian, for your question. And his question is, how can champions of climate change incorporate mental health awareness in their projects, as well as continue to be champions for this quest, especially at a time like this in the thriving pandemic? And I think that it's pretty common for people. They're being hit from all angles right now during the pandemic. And we also talked about how sometimes communities are being forced to choose between defending their rights or being able to feed their people. With all this doom and gloom news, it's pretty easy to kind of get locked into a bit of negative mentality. I know that that's been happening to me as well when I'm reading all these stories in the news about environmental degradation, people being so disrespectful to the land. So if anyone would want to start us off with a bit of an answer to Brian's question here.
Sure. Yeah, like mental health is like the impacts of mental health, and where climate change is very obvious, and industrial resource extraction is ongoing. It's fairly evident that there's a pretty direct relationship to how people's mental well-being is in comparison to where they are in terms of where resources are being extracted. So we're seeing, especially I know of, this is pretty heavy, like two people that have like taken their own lives as a result of being part of the Rainforest Flying Squad stand against old growth logging. So but telling those stories requires permission. You can't expose those people's stories without actually engaging with the families that are surviving and dealing with the grief of loss, which is in itself more mental health impacts. So it's really tricky to tell those stories and still maintain a level of decency towards the families that are still around. And so I think telling it in a general sense, like seeing what people who have a little bit of distance from those really severe and devastating impacts is a good first step, and giving space to those people who are having those devastating things happen to their families. Yeah, time before telling those stories and making sure you do it properly.
Yeah, I think having permission to tell the stories is a really important concept, and something that Western, more traditional media can often lack. People feel entitled to stories rather than really making sure that they go when they have permission from the people and from the communities that they're covering.
And editors and organizations are, I think they don't understand that sometimes it's going to take a little bit more money and time and space, and giving the people that are sent out the actual means to make sure that they're covered in a very respectful way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hopefully more and more outlets are realizing that those are all very important things that they need to make sure that they're doing. Yes, Jesse?
Yeah, I might just tag on to just yes and what Jerome said about creating space. Also, that I've seen some folks do some great things in Russia and similarly here, where activists created like online drop-in spaces where people just can come in and talk. And I think with a lot of places potentially not getting vaccines for COVID until 2024, that, you know, making sure that people have access to some online communications to be able to do that, to have messaging groups on WhatsApp. I'm in some of those where sometimes people just say, I had a really hard day with a lot of microaggressions in it, like just looking for some support and love. And they put that in the group and people just share support and love with them. And so I think that can just like having a space where you don't have to plan, where you don't have, you know, action points from a meeting or a story due, where you can just be and share is quite powerful. And I think I talked to a therapist outside the GPA who opened up her space for a story I was writing, who opened up monthly drop-ins for people dealing with racial trauma once a week, where it was not really a moderated space. It was just people can go in and just talk and self-organize. And so I think on a tactical level, those are really interesting ways of creating space, especially for people who are isolated or can't get together in person.
I think those spaces are so important, both for the people, you know, impacted by the climate change, but also the journalists who are doing this work. Like those are tough issues to cover, and journalists are doing it day after day after day, and they need space as well to really be able to take care of themselves, to be able to continue doing this very important but very difficult work. Again, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat now. We'll be able to see them. While we're waiting, I was wondering if anyone would just like to speak a little bit, you know, about their work. Are there any stories? Oh, actually, we may have one here. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm just reading it. Okay, so here, this is a question, and maybe I'll just ask this to the panel generally. So this question is from Jamil from Nigeria. He lives in northwestern Nigeria, where displaced families in rural areas have developed a local means of producing clean charcoal through cutting down of huge trees that are going extinct in those areas. In return, they sell the charcoal to the city for their daily survival. Do you think there's a story there? So what I'll ask panelists is, when you're looking at stories, when you're looking at writing things, what are the kinds of things that go through your mind to decide whether or not this is something that you should be writing on, this is something that audiences would be interested in? Is there a way that you kind of gauge whether or not this is newsworthy or something like that?
I'll go, I guess, again. I find pretty much everything interesting. I don't know. I the world is full of interesting people, and all their stories are like, if you're given the time and space to do them, they're all going to be interesting. So like, with this coal sale to the nearby city, like what I would ask, I guess, what is the history of that area? What did they subsist on? What was the indigenous life like before colonization, or the impacts of industry? Like what does that timeline look like, and why do they now have to resort to selling chunks of coal to a nearby city to survive? Yeah, just off the top of my head, and what other things could be done? Like, we're talking about, I think that's risen in conversation these days, universal basic income. Like I don't think it can be disputed that there is enough money in the world to provide for everyone, but there are certain pockets that are absorbing all of that, what we call revenue, and making sure that gets spread out. Like, is there a solution that can be reached where people in that area can make a living without needing to because even coal is still something that contributes to pollution. So like, is there a solution that doesn't require that, like with the people that are making money off of the area? So that story is definitely, I think people would benefit from reading about it and learning about the history of the area, and if there are solutions that are available that people can be at the same table with, like the people that are impacted and the people that are making the money.
So stories everywhere, just choosing how you're going to move forward. We have another question here from Karen. She writes, I really liked the point relating to the legal case where the community had to choose between clean water and their land rights. I think legal jargon is extremely important moving forward for the fight against climate change. Poverty should be recognized as a form of coercion, and sustainability should be given a legal definition. As members of the media, what role do you think we play in defining environmental communication? If anyone would like to speak to this question.
Yeah, I feel like Jesse began speaking to this earlier really well, like the way that we really play an important role in which narrative we might be perpetuating and which language we're choosing to use. We're talking about climate change. And you see this in all different sorts of areas, right? Like as far as up until only a couple years ago that mainstream media would still always put like racist in quotes because they were too scared to call something racist and too scared to call something caused by climate change, and they always have to like attribute that to someone because they were too scared to make that step. And that was like not that long ago and kind of still happens, just not as often. So I think that we play an incredibly important role in defining how we communicate about these things. And something we often talk about at the Narwhal too is the idea of complicating the narrative and trying to not make climate change an issue where, you know, there's two sides to everything, because that often just winds up being divisive. It's really everybody against climate change, and climate change affects everybody in the end. And as for the words that we use, I think poverty should be recognized as a form of coercion is an extremely interesting and idea, because this is something that comes up so often is people who are marginalized, have less material wealth, are racialized. How often are those choices really free choices, right? And we can see this in history many, many times. There are stories of, you know, especially people from First Nations and all Indigenous peoples being forcibly displaced, but, you know, it was the illusion of a choice, but it wasn't really a choice. And if you are having to debate whether you have access to food or to water or to your land, if you're feeling like you have to give up one of those things, like how is that a free choice? So that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I don't know if someone else wants to add something.
Yeah, I think the idea of what is legal and what isn't legal, what is illegal, or who is put forward as being the people in the right, as where law is concerned. Like for instance, the Wet'suwet'en on their own territory, on their own unceded Yinta, were labeled as terrorists in their own homelands, living the way they like, getting back to the way that they would like to live. And that doesn't exclude modern technology. They're still using modern technology. Like our cultures aren't monolithic. Our cultures aren't locked in some like what people determine as like caveman style of cultures. Like to me, as a journalist and as an Indigenous person, the Wet'suwet'en and the wider society should never stand for something like that, being called terrorists on your own territory, living how you want to live. So making sure that the language that you use when describing the people that are doing these actions, like right now the Rainforest Flying Squad are being called the same thing, eco-terrorists, when they're the ones that are trying to do what they think is right, to ensure that as much of the forests remain standing as is possible. And going back to what's legal, like the government decides what the annual allowable cut is, and I don't think a lot of outlets have decided to cover that through that angle, where Teal Jones is being given a permit to do something, and yeah, so I just think making sure you relay to the public, and hopefully is consumed by the public, that what is legal might not always be right.
I just wanted to add, if I can, one tiny point that Jerome reminded me of, because I know that I've seen you do this all the time in your reporting, and everyone should, but unfortunately doesn't, is literally just basing the article in the Indigenous legal system of that territory too, right? Like so much mainstream media kind of takes for granted that there's one legal system, there's the Canadian legal system, and it is supreme, even if you acknowledge that there's Indigenous legal systems, the Canadian's like the supreme one or like the real one. And I feel like I still see that so often, even if not said outright, or the Indigenous legal system of that territory is just ignored completely, so.
Great, thank you very much, and great question and really insightful answers. And I'll move on to this next question here from Laura. For so long, covering issues that affected Indigenous peoples and other historically marginalized folks and the environment were considered advocacy. I think that's slowly changing, and the traditional journalism establishment is shifting. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on neutrality and objectivity in journalism? If anyone would like to speak to that very, very important question.
Yeah, yeah, I think what people generally call objectivity and neutrality in journalism is, I don't know, kind of a myth. Like I don't see any way to cover any story unless you're a robot without emotions, or or like a person that has no connection to the actual issue that you're covering. And I don't think there is any story that is worth telling that allows for that. So I think what people like call balance, for me, what I make sure that I do is put forward the voices that are never heard, that are or seldom listened to, the people that are most impacted by whatever the overarching story is, whether it be industrial impact, climate impacts. Yeah, so I just, yeah, just back to that, I think objectivity is a myth. and making sure that what you report is factual is really the basis. There are government and industry and other large companies. they have means to get their message out, and a lot of the times, in a lot of the stories that I cover, their voice is told in the actions that they take. So I don't think it, when I write stories that basically don't have any government voices, any industry voices in them, that those are imbalanced. The reason there is a story is because there have been liberties taken, and yeah, talking to the people that are impacted is what I do.
And Jesse, I saw you move to raise your hand. Did you want to add anything to that?
I think Jerome said it beautifully. I agree. I agree. It's a myth. I'm not a journalist, so this is maybe I'm not trained in journalism, so this is my unsolicited 2 cents. But I think transparency about your positionality in a story is is really valuable in terms of just, even in consent, like who are you to tell this story? Who are you in this issue? And just being transparent about that is maybe more realistic in terms of balance. And I'm sorry for the sirens.
Yeah, I think also so important to question who gets to define what is neutral and what is objective, because certain people have just never been able to take part in that conversation and instead have had those definitions forced upon them. We have another question here. How can we use solutions journalism to connect with more conservative audiences who might not believe in climate change or see the link between human rights and the climate crisis? How do we reach these tougher audiences who would benefit from reading these stories?
I love this question because this is something that we talk about all the time at the Narwhal. Because we, connecting to the last question, often people assume, since we cover industry and the environment, that we're environmental and advocates, and we get that all the time, right? There's just that kind of inherent assumption that we often get. And so we often are trying to talk about what language to use, what stories to cover, who to talk to, because we want to also connect with, what you might call a conservative audience, or audiences who are a part of industry. We want them to read our stories. We want them to feel our stories are fair and accurate, and feel represented too. Like one of my colleagues in Alberta, Sharon O'Reilly, has written some really amazing stories that are looking at, like for example, coal workers, talking about the future of coal, looking at basically the position that they're in, try to find a way to move on from this dying industry. And so I think that just kind of, once again, what we were talking about before, trying to find a way to talk about things that isn't divisive, and also really connecting with what Jesse was saying again earlier about like where the accountability really is, like where the power really is, isn't employees and workers. That's not where it is. And that's when people feel the personal responsibility or the divisiveness comes up, when really it is the bigger powers at play there, the power structures, the people making those decisions and having those meetings that she's talking about. Those are the people. So I think that if we make that clear, that can really help make sure that like bring everyone into those stories. And once again, like I said, climate change does impact everybody, and the way that the economy is going to change, whatever a just transition means, all of that impacts everybody. And I think the other thing too is that we often talk about climate change reporting like in a silo, when really it is connected to things like labor and human rights and economy and culture and literally everything. It's not on its own. So so talking about it that way can hopefully start to sort of depoliticize the issue.
And I'm just wondering from anyone and from your work, have you seen people, I know the Narwhal does some work with complicating the narrative, and you're also trying to ask those more open-ended questions and allow people to really tell their side, their thoughts, their feelings. Have you seen people kind of start to reach across the divide on this issue? Have you seen any of that type of movement anywhere?
I have. I don't know the outcome unless there people comment on the stories that I write and get published online. I don't know what people feel or think or who's reading them really, but I take it upon myself to engage on Twitter with people, and I've seen, and it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of commitment to being open to have conversations on there with people that have differing ideas. And but I've witnessed in the conversations that I'm having, people are willing to start to understand that there are several different ways to view this world, and what is considered right and the way to do things is, I think, responsible for a lot of the woes that we're experiencing, as much as like Western civilization wants to claim all of the accolades for for the good things that are in the world right now, it is in a large way responsible for a lot of the negative impacts also. So yeah, so I've seen lots of people and I engage with them frequently, and maybe it's not that great for my mental health, but I find that when I start to get people to think about something in a different way, engaging directly, that yeah, and I'm seeing several people starting to feel like they, when they start engaging with me, they'll say, oh, you're obviously a liberal, or you're obviously this or that, and I'm like, I'm none of those things. Like, I'm just a human being that is raised in the Indigenous worldview that I'm trying to share with you what some different ideas that you might want to consider. And I think journalism is that in general. Is I would like everybody to read my stories, back to the last question, like, but I have no ability to make people do that. So I find Twitter is a really good place to engage with people directly. And yeah, it's promising, I think.
I'll just ask quickly if anyone would like to add on to what Jerome just said. I think that, oh yes, go ahead, Jessie.
No, we're out of time. I would, yeah, I think that was wonderful. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's a wonderful way to finish this conversation. And I hope that we can all keep having more conversations with each other, learning about different people's perspectives and their worldviews, and really showcasing that that beautiful diversity in journalism, and just learning more about each other. So with that, I would like to just say again, a big thank you to our panelists. So wonderful to have you here, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with all of us. And thank you to all of our attendees for listening. We do also post all of our webinars on our YouTube channel if you ever miss any or want to rewatch them or send them to people who you think might be interested. And you can always follow JHR on Twitter and Facebook, and also all of our wonderful participants to learn more about their work and what they do. So with that, I will say good day to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Can't miss them.